So Lex here, welcome back to another video. So in this video we're going to be talking about submission to God and what it actually means to follow God and submit to God. And I think the stories of like Noah and Abraham that I actually just read about this morning that I'm making this video, I think they're pretty good examples of like how they submitted to God and feared God and actually obeyed God, which a lot of people, they kind of just live their whole life willfully and they don't actually listen to God and try to submit to God at all. And that's kind of the essence of the problem is a lot of people pretend to follow God, but they don't actually ever submit to God and they actually don't know God at all. And they don't actually they kind of just assume sometimes that God wants them to do something, especially if they don't hear God at all in their life. They kind of just pretend they know God and, they know the Father in the skies or something. And, they think they know what God wants them to do, but it's inherently how they're living is completely opposed to how God wants them to live, and they are actually even unconsciously or consciously resisting God. So think about Noah when he built the ark for 120 years. How many people could endure that kind of hardship for God? And he, in this case, listened to God and he took it to his heart, even though God never actually was there to speak to Noah after the commandment he received to build the ark. He basically built it without actually having any motivation necessarily from God or God saying anything after that till he got the signal that the flood is coming. So he did all that for 120 years. Who could actually submit for 120 years and do that? Same thing with Abraham and Isaac, and Isaac, being there, on the offering altar, and Abraham having to sacrifice him and obey God and fear God. He did it. And he was about to do it, and God, of course, stopped him because he didn't want to, waste his life, of course. And Abraham was given the son, and that just shows that, these people were willing to have real humanity, and they actually thought of God and what God wanted them to do, and they were actually created beings and had, humanity in a sense. Perhaps they were still, they don't necessarily have, the potential to actually release their corruptions like we do nowadays, thanks to God. But, they still were able to have all this humanity and do what God says. How many people nowadays can do that with how people act nowadays and do everything against God and very willfully and everything? So think about that, as an actual submission to God, and how many people think they are submissive to God, and how, in a sense, weak we are in terms of going through hardship and fatigue and everything else compared to people in the past. Of course, different times, and we have technology and everything is easier today and so on. So it's kind of interesting to think about. And I think this highlights pretty well how you actually submit to God, and it's to basically obey what God wants you to do. And that's really true submission. We might have easier tasks perhaps, I would say, nowadays than back then. There's still hardship in our own ways, to our own degrees, that you have to go through for God and in our lives. And so, yeah, I feel like this is something I just wanted to touch on, is how to submit to actually God when you're following God on your faith journey. And, what may seem hard to us, you just have to remember that there are being people also under God who have done and obeyed God, done their duties, and they've been through much harder things than we have. And that's, I think, very motivating as a standpoint when you remember that, when you're going through your own struggles and journeys in your faith, is to remember that we have it a lot easier. And even though it might seem hard, I think it's not that hard in comparison. And, of course, a hardship is a hardship. It doesn't necessarily change the pain of the hardship, necessarily how you feel about it. Everybody has their calibers and circumstances, and they find themselves in them. And it's not like pain isn't real and so on, and hardship isn't real that we go through. Everything requires a certain level of hardship, like making something, creating something big. Maybe it's a movie, a music piece, whatever. It does require some hardship to do it, depending, of course, how you feel about it. But or doing something simple like work, whatever it is for you, farming, could be anything. But things require time and effort. And when you go through these hardships, you just have to remember, especially if it's something God told you to actually build and do, that it's important to obey God's words and practice God's words in your life and submit to God. And that's pretty much the essence of this video, and I think I really need to say more of that. I think we got the essence. which is to submit to God properly and remember that these people, how they did it, and we should use them as models to understand and come to submit to God properly, and not just like pretend that we're submitting to God when we're actually going on our own paths and ways and wills, but it's not actually God's intention for us. I hope this helps. You think about actually submitting to God and how that relates to your faith journey, the way you're at right now. Think about how you're acting. If there's a will, there's a way. God bless. Thank you for watching. Would like to donate in the description if you'd like one-on-one call in the description as well. Thank you. And thank you for watching.